I cancelled my vacation to take care of my parents only for them to say that my brother, hypocrite, doing more, while he went and did nothing. I was tired of it, and when I heard what they were saying I said who actually helped and did it. When my parents asked if I could come help them for a few weeks, I didn't hesitate. They're older now, and I figured it was the least I could do. My vacation plans could wait. I had time. Their house needed repairs, and they couldn't manage everything themselves. My mom complained about the leaking faucet, the broken gate, the outdated wiring. My dad grumbled about the sagging roof and the squeaky floors. They needed someone, and since my brother, Greg, lived close by, I figured he'd been helping already. I was wrong. When I arrived, it was clear that nothing had been touched in months, maybe years. The house looked like it was on the verge of collapse. Greg was there too, lounging in the living room, scrolling on his phone. He gave me a half-hearted nod when I walked in. "You're finally here," my mom said, as if I'd been avoiding them. "There's so much to do. I don't know why we waited so long to call you." I ignored the sting in her words and got to work. I fixed the faucet first, then tackled the gate. By the end of the first day, I was exhausted, but I felt accomplished. Surely they'd appreciate the effort. But instead of gratitude, all I heard were complaints. "Why did you fix it like that?" my mom asked, inspecting the gate with a critical eye. "Greg would have done it differently." Greg, of course, didn't lift a finger. He just shrugged and said, "She's picky about stuff." I let it slide. It was only the first day, after all. The second day started early. I was up before anyone else, ready to tackle the wiring in the garage that my dad had been complaining about for weeks. I spent hours crawling through dust and cobwebs, carefully replacing the old wires with new ones. When I came inside, sweating and covered in grime, I found Greg sitting at the kitchen table eating breakfast. My mom was fussing over him like he was some kind of prince. "Do you want more eggs, sweetheart?" she asked, completely ignoring me as I walked past. "Don't forget to check the gutters," my dad called out from the living room. I barely had a chance to sit down before my mom turned to me. "What took you so long in the garage?" she asked. "It shouldn't have taken that long." I opened my mouth to explain, but Greg cut in. "He's probably overthinking it," he said with a smirk. I bit my tongue and got back to work. That afternoon, I climbed up to the roof to clean the gutters. Greg was supposed to be holding the ladder, but after a few minutes, he disappeared back inside. I finished the job on my own, feeling the weight of their expectations pressing harder with every task. When I came down, Greg was sitting on the couch with my dad, laughing about something. My mom walked past me without a glance, muttering about how the roof still needed repairs. By the end of the day, my patience was wearing thin. It wasn't just a lack of appreciation. It was the way Greg basked in their approval without lifting a finger. By the third day, I was running on fumes. I'd been up early every morning and working late into the evening, trying to get through the endless list of tasks my parents had given me. My body ached, my patience was wearing thin, and Greg was becoming more unbearable by the hour. It wasn't just that Greg did nothing. It was how he managed to turn his laziness into a virtue in our parents' eyes. While I was in the garage repairing the old wiring, I heard my mom in the kitchen, cooing over Greg like he was a saint. "Thank you for always being here for us," she said warmly. "Not like your brother, who only shows up when it's convenient for him." I stopped mid-wire, my jaw tightening. Convenient? I'd cancelled a long-awaited vacation to come here. I'd spent every waking moment fixing their house while Greg hadn't lifted a single finger. But to her, he was the dutiful son. Later, when I came in to grab a glass of water, Greg was sitting on the couch with his feet up, scrolling through his phone. "Hey," he said without looking up. "Mom wants you to check the gutters next. They're overflowing." I bit my tongue and headed back out without saying a word. It wasn't just the lack of help. It was the little things Greg did that made my blood boil. Like how he'd casually drop complaints about my work. "The gate feels loose," he said when I walked back inside, still covered in grime. "You might want to tighten it again." Or the time he helped by holding the ladder while I cleaned the gutters, only to disappear halfway through because Mom needed him for something. I almost lost it when I found out what something was. Greg had been sitting in the kitchen, eating pie while Mom made him tea. When I walked in, covered in sweat and dirt, Mom gave me a glance that said I wasn't doing enough. "You're not done yet?" she asked, her voice tinged with impatience. "There's so much more to do, and we can't wait forever." Greg, of course, added his 2 cents. "Yeah, man," he said with a smirk. "You've been up there forever. What's taking so long?" I wanted to snap, to tell them exactly where they could shove their comments, but I didn't. I swallowed my frustration and headed back outside. That evening, after another grueling day, I overheard them talking in the living room. "At least Greg is here for us," my mom said. "Not like your brother. He only shows up when it suits him." Greg chuckled softly. "Yeah, I don't know why he even bothered coming. He doesn't have the patience for this kind of thing." I froze in the hallway, my fists clenched. Patience? I'd been doing everything while Greg sat on his ass and played the role of the golden child. I wanted to march in there and set them straight, but I bit my tongue, again. Instead, I went to bed, trying to ignore the anger boiling in my chest. The next day, my resolve started to waver. I woke up sore and exhausted, the weight of unappreciated effort pressing down on me. Greg, of course, was still in bed, even though it was past 9 a.m. I could hear my mom humming in the kitchen as she cooked breakfast for him. Not me, him. "Make sure Greg gets enough to eat," my dad had said the night before. "He's been such a big help around here." Big help? I'd spent the past 3 days sweating through manual labor while Greg had barely broken a sweat lifting a fork. By the time he finally emerged from his room, I'd already replaced 2 fence posts in the backyard. My dad came out to check on me and immediately pointed out the uneven paint job on one of the posts. "You should fix that," he said, as if the entire fence wasn't a mess before I touched it. Greg strolled out behind him, sipping coffee, and said, "Yeah, it's a little off." I gripped the hammer tightly, the urge to snap almost unbearable. Instead, I took a deep breath and asked, "Are you going to help with anything today, Greg?" He grinned. "I've got some stuff to do with Mom," he said casually. "She needs my input on the groceries." Groceries. That was his idea of helping. As the day went on, it became clear that Greg was more interested in playing mediator than actually contributing. When I was up on the roof repairing a leak, I overheard him in the kitchen again. "You know, he's kind of rough around the edges," he said, his voice low but loud enough for me to catch. "I don't think he's cut out for this kind of work." My mom sighed. "He's always been like that. But at least he's trying, I guess." Trying? That word echoed in my head as I climbed down the ladder. I'd fixed the wiring, patched holes, cleaned gutters, and now I was on the roof, and I was trying? Greg walked outside, hands in his pockets, watching me as I worked. "Looks like you missed a spot," he said, pointing to an area of shingles I hadn't gotten to yet. I didn't respond. I couldn't trust myself to speak without unleashing the anger I'd been bottling up. By the end of the day, I was done. Physically, emotionally, mentally, just done. But I still hadn't reached the breaking point. That would come later, when I overheard a conversation that would change everything. By the time the 5th day rolled around, I was barely holding it together. My body felt like it had been through a grinder, and my patience was worn so thin it might as well have been non-existent. Greg, on the other hand, was thriving in his role as the self-proclaimed peacekeeper. He spent the morning lounging in the living room, scrolling on his phone while Mom handed him a plate of pancakes. "You've been so helpful, sweetheart," she said, ruffling his hair like he was still a kid. "We couldn't do this without you." I was outside repairing the shed door when Dad walked over, shaking his head. "You're making a mess," he said, gesturing to the tools I had laid out. "Greg wouldn't have left everything like this." Greg? The same Greg who wouldn't know a hammer from a wrench if it hit him in the face? I clenched my jaw, biting back the words I wanted to say. It got worse at lunch. As I sat down, exhausted and drenched in sweat, Mom wrinkled her nose. You're dripping everywhere, she said. Couldn't you clean up before sitting at the table? Greg snorted into his soda. Yeah, man, don't ruin the vibe, he said, smirking. I slammed my glass of water down harder than I meant to, but nobody seemed to notice. They were too busy fawning over Greg's amazing suggestion to paint the living room a different color. He's got such an eye for these things, Mom said, smiling at Greg like he just invented sliced bread. After lunch, I went back to work. The roof still needed patching, and I was determined to finish it before the day ended. But as I climbed the ladder, I couldn't stop replaying the morning in my head, Mom's constant complaints, Dad's nitpicking, Greg's smug grin. I came down an hour later, drenched in sweat, and walked inside to grab a drink. That's when I heard it, the conversation that would finally push me over the edge. Greg's voice floated from the kitchen, loud and clear. I don't know why he even bothered coming here, he said, his tone dripping with disdain. He's just making things harder. Mom chimed in, her voice low but sharp. He's always been like this. Overthinks everything, makes a mess. If it weren't for you, Greg, we'd be lost. My dad added. He's trying, but he's not cut out for this kind of thing. You're the reliable one. Reliable. Greg. The same Greg who hadn't done a single useful thing since I arrived. Something inside me snapped. I walked into the kitchen, my boots thudding loudly against the floor. The conversation stopped mid-sentence, as all three of them turned to look at me. You think I'm not cut out for this? I said, my voice low and shaking with barely contained rage. I've been busting my ass since the moment I got here. Fixing your house. Cleaning your messes. And you're sitting here praising Greg for doing nothing? Their stunned silence was the only response I needed. I've been fixing everything you've neglected for years, I said, glaring at each of them. And Greg? He hasn't done a damn thing except sit around and let you fawn over him. Greg shifted uncomfortably in his seat but didn't say anything. Mom finally broke the silence. We're just saying you could do things a little better. Better? I repeated, my voice rising. I canceled my vacation to be here. I've been working nonstop while you praise Greg for lifting a fork. Dad crossed his arms, looking annoyed. You don't have to make a scene. I laughed bitterly. A scene? This isn't a scene, this is reality. You've let this house fall apart, you've let Greg mooch off you, and when I step in to help, I'm the problem? They all stared at me, dumbfounded. Greg opened his mouth, but I cut him off. Don't even start. You're the biggest hypocrite here. Without waiting for a response, I walked out of the kitchen and into my room. I slammed the door behind me and started throwing my belongings into my bag. My hands shook with a mix of anger and exhaustion, but I wasn't about to stick around and take more of their nonsense. I could hear muffled voices from the kitchen, probably Greg trying to play innocent or Mom making excuses for him. I didn't care. I'd had enough. The bag was packed in minutes. As I zipped it up, the absurdity of the situation hit me again. I'd come here out of goodwill, sacrificing my time and energy, only to be treated like an inconvenience. When I stepped into the hallway, Greg was there, leaning against the wall. He gave me that smug look he'd perfected. You're really leaving? He asked, his tone dripping with fake surprise. Yeah, I said, brushing past him. Enjoy being the reliable one. I didn't stop to explain myself further. I headed straight for the door, ignoring my parents' calls from the kitchen. As I reached the front door, my mom burst out of the kitchen, her voice sharp and accusing. So that's it? You're just walking out? I turned to face her, bag slung over my shoulder, my chest tight with frustration. What else do you want from me, Mom? I asked, my voice steady but loaded with anger. I've done everything you asked, fixed the house, cleaned your messes, canceled my plans, and all I've heard in return is how I'm not good enough. Her eyes widened, but before she could respond, Greg appeared behind her, leaning casually against the wall. He looked at me with that smug expression he always wore, the one that said he thought he was untouchable. You're being dramatic, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Nobody asked you to come here and act like a hero. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You didn't ask because you've never had to do anything for anyone, Greg. You just sit around letting Mom and Dad worship you while the rest of us clean up the messes you leave behind. Greg's smirk faltered, but he didn't reply. My dad stepped into the doorway, his arms crossed, shaking his head. You don't have to make a scene, he said, his voice low and dismissive. A scene? I repeated, my voice rising. I'm not making a scene, I'm telling the truth. You sit here complaining about everything, praising Greg for doing absolutely nothing, and treating me like a hired hand. My mom bristled, her face reddening. We never said we didn't appreciate you, she snapped. But you've always been difficult. Difficult? I said, my voice trembling with rage. I'm difficult because I refuse to sit back and let you walk all over me. I'm difficult because I've been the only one here actually doing anything while Greg lounges around like a king. You call that difficult? Fine. I'll take it. The room fell silent for a moment. Greg shifted uncomfortably, and my mom's indignation faltered. But I wasn't done. You don't want help, you want someone to blame, I said, looking directly at my parents. Well, I'm done being that person. If Greg's so perfect, let him take care of everything from now on. I grabbed the door handle, pulling it open with a force that made it rattle. Before stepping out, I turned back one last time. Don't bother calling me to fix anything again. You've made it clear I'm not welcome here. Without waiting for a response, I stepped outside, letting the door slam shut behind me. I didn't look back as the door slammed shut behind me. The cool air hit my face, but it wasn't enough to calm the storm inside me. My car was parked at the end of the driveway, and each step toward it felt like shedding a layer of the weight I'd been carrying. I tossed my bag in the back seat, slid into the driver's seat, and gripped the steering wheel tightly. For a moment, I just sat there, breathing heavily, staring at the house where I'd spent the last few days breaking my back for people who couldn't care less. Inside, I could hear muffled voices, probably my parents scolding each other or Greg making excuses. It didn't matter anymore. With a deep breath, I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway. The house grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but the anger in my chest stayed. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't coming back. It didn't take long for the calls to begin. Barely an hour after I left, my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I glanced at the screen. Mom. I ignored it. A few minutes later, it buzzed again. This time, it was Dad. Then Greg. They took turns calling, one after another, as if they thought sheer persistence would make me answer. I drove in silence, letting the buzzing blend into the background noise. They hadn't cared enough to listen when I was there, so why should I care now? The voicemails started piling up, too. My mom's voice was predictably dramatic, filled with phrases like, "How could you leave us like this?" and "You're being unreasonable." Dad's were more muted but still accusatory. Greg didn't even leave messages, just kept calling like a persistent gnat. I turned off my phone. For the first time in days, the silence felt like peace. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me. I turned my phone back on, knowing full well it was a mistake. The missed calls and messages flooded in, but I ignored most of them. Then my phone rang again. This time, it was Mom. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Finally," she snapped before I could say anything. "Do you have any idea how worried we've been?" "Worried?" I said, my voice calm but strained. "You're worried now? You weren't worried when I was doing everything for you while you criticized me." "Well, we didn't ask you to act like a martyr," Greg's voice chimed in. Apparently, they had me on speakerphone. "If you couldn't handle it, you shouldn't have come." I laughed bitterly. "Handle it? I came because you couldn't be bothered, Greg. I was the one fixing everything while you sat on your ass, pretending to care." Dad cut in next, his voice tight with irritation. "There's no need for this attitude. You're blowing everything out of proportion. We didn't mean anything by what we said." "Didn't mean anything?" I repeated, my anger bubbling to the surface. "You let Greg sit there doing nothing, called him the reliable one, and treated me like an outsider. But sure, I'm the one overreacting. You're being dramatic, Mom said, her tone turning sharp. You've always had a tendency to make everything about you. That was it. I'd had enough. No, I said firmly. This isn't about me. This is about the way you've treated me my whole life. Greg does nothing, and you praise him. I sacrifice my time, my energy, and my plans, and you call me difficult. I'm done. There was a stunned silence on the other end, but it didn't last. Greg started to say something, but I cut him off. Don't bother, Greg. You're not worth the time or the breath. Before they could respond, I ended the call and blocked their numbers. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace. They had taken enough of my time and energy. It was time to focus on myself.